What Issei was descendant of Beerus and married with Vedos. The rain came down in sheets over Ko town, the kind of heavy, gray autumn downpour that made the streets glitter like rivers of black glass under the lamplight. Most people had retreated indoors hours ago. Sensible people. Normal people. Issei Hayadu was not a normal person. He was on his knees in the middle of an abandoned industrial lot at the edge of the city, one arm braced against the cracked asphalt, blood dripping from his chin onto the ground below. His school uniform, or what remained of it, was torn at the shoulders and scorched along the left side. The sacred gear on his arm pulsed weakly, its red gem flickering like a candle in a wind tunnel. Across from him stood something that barely deserved to be called a person anymore. It had once been a stray devil, a mid-class one at that, barely worth a second glance by the standards of the Grimry peerage. But something had happened to it. Something wrong. Its body had expanded grotesquely, veins of sickly purple energy crawling across its skin like cracks in old porcelain. Its eyes were gone, replaced by two voids that seemed to pull light in rather than reflect it. Whatever intelligence it had once possessed had been consumed by raw, ravenous hunger. "Drag," Issei muttered through gritted teeth, spitting blood to the side. "Tell me you've got something." "Partner," came the ancient dragon's voice from within the sacred gear, low and steady as always, but carrying an unusual undercurrent of tension. "I have been analyzing this entity's energy for the past 4 minutes. It is not purely demonic in origin." "Yeah, I figured that out when it shrugged off a boost-enhanced Welsh dragon punch. There is something else within it. Something I have not encountered in my long existence. It resonates at a frequency I cannot identify, older than devil power, older than angel power, older even than the primordial dragons." The stray devil lurched forward, crossing 20 meters in a single shambling step, and brought a fist down like a meteorite. Issei dove left, the impact cratering the asphalt where he'd been kneeling, shockwaves tearing through the air, and sending him skidding across the wet ground. He rolled, came up on one knee, and thrust his arm forward. Boost, 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 boost. The sacred gear roared, power building to a fever pitch, and Issei channeled everything into a single compressed blast from his fist. A dragon shot, dense enough to level a building. It hit the stray devil square in the chest. The creature stumbled. That was it. One stumble, and then it straightened up, the purple energy knitting the hole in its torso closed, like a wound healing in reverse. "Okay," Issei said quietly. "That's a problem." He had set Rias a distress signal 4 minutes ago. At current travel speed, the rest of the peerage was probably 6 minutes out. That was 6 minutes he needed to survive against something that apparently couldn't be hurt. The creature opened its mouth, or rather, the lower half of its face simply split apart, revealing an abyss that produced a sound not unlike the groan of tectonic plates grinding against each other. Then it rushed him. Issei had good instincts. Years of devil work, hundreds of battles, a sacred gear housing one of the two most powerful dragons in history. All of that had sharpened him into something considerably more dangerous than the perverted high schooler he still liked to pretend to be. His instinct screamed at him to move right. He moved right. The creature's arm caught him anyway, a grazing blow that felt like being hit by a freight train, and Issei was airborne for a long, horrible second before he crashed through the wall of a nearby warehouse, and came to rest in a heap amid broken crates and scattered machinery parts. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the corrugated metal ceiling, rain hammering against it in a constant roar. "Drag. I am here, partner. I think I might actually be in trouble." A fair assessment. Issei pushed himself upright, breathing hard. His ribs screamed. At least 2 were cracked, possibly more. His left arm was responding sluggishly. He'd landed on it wrong. The sacred gear's gem was still flickering, power reserves lower than he'd like. The wall of the warehouse peeled away as though it were made of paper, and the creature loomed in the gap, that horrible split face turning toward him. And then something shifted. It started in his chest. Not pain, not the familiar burn of sacred gear power, but something different entirely. Something deeper. It was like a door opening in the center of his ribcage. A door he hadn't known existed, leading somewhere that had no business being inside a human body. The sensation moved outward from that central point in waves, traveling along his veins, his bones, his nerves, reaching the tips of his fingers and the top of his skull in a slow, inexorable tide. The sacred gear's flickering stopped. It didn't power up. It didn't boost. It simply went still, as though even Drake had gone quiet to make room for whatever was happening. "Partner," Drake said, and there was something in the dragon's ancient voice that Issei had never heard before, something that might, on a lesser being, have been called awe. "What is this?" Issei didn't answer because he couldn't. The door in his chest was open all the way now, and through it came something that had no name in any language he'd ever learned, something that was not energy in any conventional sense, but was instead the absence of energy, or rather, the authority over energy, the power to look at something that existed and simply decide that it should not. His hand rose without any conscious direction from him. He looked at it. His palm was glowing, not with the red of the sacred gear, not with any color he could name. It was as though the light itself was being unmade at the center of his hand, a small circle of pure unmaking that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. The stray devil saw it. For the first time since this fight had begun, the creature hesitated. Something in whatever remained of its instincts recognized what it was looking at, and recognized that recognition as the last thing it would ever do. Issei's arm moved. He didn't choose to attack. He didn't think, "I'll use this power to destroy the enemy." The motion came from somewhere below thought, below instinct, from whatever ancestral memory had just cracked open inside him. His hand swept outward in a casual gesture, almost dismissive, the kind of motion you might use to brush crumbs off a table. The stray devil came apart, not explosively, not violently. It simply ceased, the purple energy and the corrupted devil matter and whatever alien force had been animating it all simply erasing themselves from existence in a smooth, quiet wave that moved from the creature's center outward to its extremities. Between one heartbeat and the next, there was a stray devil. In the next, there was nothing, not ash, not residue, not so much as a stain on the broken warehouse floor. Silence. Then Issei's knees hit the ground. The door in his chest closed. The strange light vanished from his hand. His ribs remembered they were cracked. His arm remembered it had been landed on wrong, and every accumulated injury from the past half-hour announced itself at once with considerable enthusiasm. He sat in the wreckage of the warehouse, and breathed and tried to understand what he had just done. "Drake," he said finally. "Yes, partner." "What was that?" A pause. Drake was not given to pauses. The Welsh dragon had opinions on everything, and typically shared them without hesitation. A pause from Drake meant the dragon was genuinely uncertain, and Issei had never known Drake to be genuinely uncertain about anything. "I do not know," Drake said at last. "In all my centuries of existence, in all the battles I have witnessed and participated in all the powers I have catalogued and understood, I have encountered what you just produced only once before. In stories. Ancient stories, older than devil kind, older than the current order of heaven. Stories about beings who existed before the framework of this world was established. Beings who could just erase things? Gods of destruction," Drake said quietly. "That is the closest term your current world has for them. Beings whose purpose and nature is the elimination of what exists. The power you just used, I do not know how it is in you, or why it is in you, but that is what it was. The Hawkeye. The power of destruction at its most fundamental." Issei stared at his hand. It looked entirely normal now. The same hand that had caught enough footballs in gym class to know he had mediocre hand-eye coordination, that had reached for breasts with entirely too much enthusiasm on numerous occasions, that had been thrust forward in thousands of sacred gear attacks. Normal. Ordinary. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "I'm Issei Hayadu. I'm from Kuo. My parents run a household in a residential district, and my dad works in insurance." Nobody in my family has ever had any supernatural. He stopped, because the door in his chest, which he thought had closed, had not entirely closed. There was a crack remaining, and through that crack came something new, not power this time, but information. Memory, except it wasn't his memory. It arrived in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror falling into place one by one. A vast emptiness. Stars being born and dying in milliseconds. Galaxies wheeling through space like slow hurricanes. A figure, large, imposing, with enormous ears, and the bearing of something that had never in its entire existence needed to justify itself to anyone. Purple skin, golden eyes that held the casual, unimpressed arrogance of something so powerful it had long since stopped being impressed by power. A name. The name arrived with the weight of a mountain and the finality of an ending. Beerus. And alongside the name, a chain of connection that stretched back through generations, through bloodlines that had been diluted by time and by the complicated mechanics of how divine essence filtered down, through mortal descendants, each generation a little more human, a little less God, but never entirely either. A line that had wound its way from the divine to the mortal, from universe-spanning power to a teenage boy kneeling in a broken warehouse in the rain. Issei, descended from the god of destruction. Oh, Issei said. Partner, Drake said carefully, you have gone very quiet. I just had a vision. Or a memory. Or something. He pressed his fist against the ground, steadying himself. Drake, have you ever heard of someone called Beerus? The pause this time was different from the first one. Longer. Heavier. Yes, Drake said finally. Where did you hear that name? It was in the vision. The memory. Whatever it was. Issei looked up at the hole in the warehouse wall, at the rain coming through it, at the night sky barely visible through the clouds. He's apparently my ancestor. Silence from Drake. Then, very quietly, partner. Yeah. If that is true, if there is even a fraction of genuine god of destruction bloodline in you, then everything I thought I understood about your potential needs to be revised entirely. How revised? Considerably. The sound of movement outside, rapid, purposeful. The cavalry had arrived. Issei heard Rias's voice calling his name, heard Akino and Kaneko and Kiba, heard them spreading out to search the wreckage. He should call out to them. He should let them know he was okay. He stayed quiet for another moment, looking at his hand in the darkness. The stray devil was gone. Utterly gone, not even a trace remaining. He had done that with a gesture. A single, casual, barely conscious gesture. He thought about what it meant to carry the blood of something that had existed before the current order of the world. He thought about the door in his chest, and what it had felt like when it opened, and the quiet certainty that had come through it, not the hot, burning certainty of boost and dragon power, but something cooler and far more absolute, the certainty of ending. Issei. Rias appeared in the gap in the wall, crimson hair plastered to her face by the rain, her expression cycling rapidly through relief and concern and something that was trying to be controlled anger, but hadn't quite made it there yet. Behind her, the others. Are you? What happened to you? And where is the stray devil? We tracked it to this location, but there's no trace. It's gone, Issei said. Gone where? Did you seal it? Because I don't see it. Just gone, Rias. He looked up at her. I destroyed it. Something in his voice made her stop. She looked at him, really looked, the way Rias Grimmery looked at things when she was taking them seriously, when the heiress of one of the oldest devil families was applying her full considerable intelligence to a problem. Her eyes moved to his hand, then back to his face. How? She asked quietly. That, Issei said, is a very long conversation. The Occult Research Club's clubroom was warm, and smelled of tea and old books, a sharp contrast to the cold and rain outside. Issei sat in his usual chair, newly bandaged thanks to Akino's healing. She clicked her tongue at the cracked ribs, and made a comment about him being reckless that had the warmth of genuine concern buried under the professional criticism. Kaneko had brought him a cup of tea without being asked, and then gone to sit in her corner with her cat in her lap, which from Kaneko was practically a declaration of deep personal affection. Kiba had said nothing but had quietly placed himself between Issei and the door, a protective positioning that was either deliberate or simply natural habit. With Kiba, it was often hard to tell. Ria sat across from him, her expression composed in the way it got when she was preparing to hear something significant. Issei told them everything. He told them about the battle, about the point at which conventional sacred gear power had failed, about the sensation of something opening in his chest. He described what the power had felt like, not like dragon energy, not like devil power, not like anything in the catalog of supernatural forces they dealt with regularly. He described the vision, the chain of memory, the name that had arrived with the weight of an ending. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Beerus, Ria said, testing the word carefully. You're saying your ancestor was someone named Beerus, a god of destruction. That's what Drake called him. All eyes went, involuntarily, to the sacred gear on Issei's arm. It was as though they were waiting for the dragon within to confirm or deny. The name is accurate, Drake said, which made Akino's breath catch slightly. The dragon rarely spoke directly into the room in a way that others could hear. Beerus is, the distinction becomes complicated when discussing beings of that nature, a god of destruction. A being whose existence predates the current supernatural order of this world. I have encountered references to such beings in the oldest records accessible to me, but only as distant legends. The idea that one of them had descendants walking this earth was not something I had considered as a possibility. Is it possible? Kiba asked. For a being of that level to have mortal descendants? Divine bloodlines diminish over generations, Ria said slowly, thinking aloud, but they don't disappear entirely. We see it in devil families, ancient lines carrying the power of original sin, diluted across centuries, but still present. If a god of destruction were to have offspring with mortal or semi-mortal beings, the bloodline would thin over generations, but the essential nature might remain latent, dormant. She looked at Issei, until something activated it. The near-death state, Akino offered. Extreme stress can unlock dormant power. We've seen that with sacred gear possessors before. Or perhaps, Ria said, the creature itself triggered it. You said Drake couldn't identify the energy in the stray devil, that it was something ancient, something that resonated at a frequency older than conventional supernatural power. Perhaps encountering that kind of energy was what caused Issei's bloodline to respond. Like recognizes like, Kaneko said from her corner, without looking up. Something old enough woke up something old enough. Issei looked at her. Sometimes Kaneko's observations arrived like that, quiet, precise, and several steps ahead of where the conversation had been. The problem, Riz continued, standing and beginning to pace, which she did when she was working through something that genuinely worried her, is that if this is real, if Issei genuinely carries God of Destruction bloodline, then we are in territory that none of the three factions have any framework for. The balance between devils and fallen angels is already complicated enough. Adding a power that predates all of that operates on a completely different level, could cause problems, Issei finished, could cause considerable problems. The kind of problems that involve factions going to great lengths to control something they don't understand and are frightened by. She stopped pacing and looked at him directly. Issei, I need you to not use that power again until we understand what it is and what using it means. He opened his mouth. I know, she said, forestalling him, that in a life-or-death situation you'll do what you have to do. I'm not asking you to die to keep it secret. I'm asking you to be careful, to not demonstrate this to anyone we haven't already told. Can you do that? He thought about the quiet certainty that had come through the crack in his chest, the cool absoluteness of it, the way it had felt more like falling than fighting. Yeah, he said. I can do that, Rias nodded. Then, in the quieter voice she used when she was talking to him rather than managing the situation, are you all right? Weirdly? He considered. Yeah, I think so. He held up his hand, looked at the ordinary palm and the ordinary fingers. It didn't feel bad, using it. It felt like something that belonged to me, something that was always there, and I just didn't know about it. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing you said tonight, Aquino said pleasantly, refilling his tea. He went home late, walking through the rain that had thinned to a drizzle, hands in his pockets, mind turning the evening over and over. In his room, in the quiet dark, he lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and thought about gods. He knew, in the abstract way anyone knows things about powerful supernatural beings, that there were levels to the cosmos. Devils and angels and fallen angels were the framework of his world, but even within that framework there were gradations. Satan-class devils at the top of the devil hierarchy, seraph-level angels in heaven, beings like Cerzex and Ajuka who operated at a level that most of the supernatural world could barely conceptualize. Above that, his understanding got hazier. Dragon gods. Primordial entities. Forces that had existed since before the current age. Gods of destruction, apparently. He tried to imagine what it meant to be descended from something like that. It wasn't the same as being a devil. Being a devil was a specific, structured thing with rules and hierarchies, and a culture that had developed over millennia. Carrying the blood of a god of destruction was something else entirely, something that came without a rulebook, without a community of people who shared it, without any framework at all. Just him, and the door in his chest, and the quiet power on the other side of it. Drig, he said to the darkness. Partner, what's on the other side of that door? If I were to train it, develop it, what does it become? A long pause. I cannot say with certainty. Gods of destruction in the traditions I have access to are beings of immense, fundamental power. They do not merely fight, they unmake. Their authority is over existence itself, the power to determine what continues and what does not. The Hakai technique he used today was the crudest, most instinctive expression of that authority. What it becomes with training and development. Another pause. I think we would need a teacher. Someone who actually understands that kind of power. And where would we find someone like that? Drake was quiet for a moment. Then, I suspect, partner, that someone like that might find us first. An energy signature like what you produced tonight. It would not go unnoticed by anyone sensitive enough to recognize it. Issei stared at the ceiling. He thought about the vision, the vast emptiness of space, the wheeling galaxies, the figure with the golden eyes, and the absolute bearing of something that had never answered to anyone. His ancestor. Weird family, he said to the darkness. From within the sacred gear came something that, in a being considerably less dignified than an ancient dragon, might have been a quiet chuckle. Outside, the rain stopped. The clouds broke apart, slowly, revealing patches of night sky between them, the stars cold and distant, and entirely indifferent to the small, improbable fact of a teenage boy in Kuo town, who had just discovered that the blood of gods ran in his veins. Somewhere, in a region of existence that had no coordinates comprehensible to any navigation system available in this world, something enormous and gold-eyed opened its eyes. And somewhere closer, in a place that occupied no specific location, but was nonetheless real, a figure in a white uniform felt a ripple pass through the fabric of existence, clean and precise and unmistakable as a tuning fork struck against the edge of the universe, and tilted her head with an expression of genuine, unhurried interest. She raised her staff slightly, considering. Then she smiled, small and private and entirely controlled, and began to calculate the most efficient route to a particular small town in Japan. The morning after the warehouse incident arrived with a particular cruelty that mornings reserved for people who had spent their nights not sleeping. Issei sat at the breakfast table while his mother moved around the kitchen with cheerful efficiency, setting plates and asking questions about school that he answered on autopilot. His father was behind a newspaper. The television murmured weather forecasts. Everything was perfectly, aggressively normal, the kind of normal that felt, in the wake of last night, almost satirical. He looked at his hand over the rim of his rice bowl. Normal hand. Normal fingers. No glow, no strange light, no quiet certainty of absolute endings. Just Issei Hayadu, eating breakfast with his family in their perfectly ordinary house, trying to reconcile the fact that somewhere in his ancestral line there existed a being of such fundamental power that even a dragon, who had existed for centuries, hadn't known quite what to say about it. Issei, his mother said, pausing behind him and touching his shoulder gently. You look tired. Did you sleep? A little, he said. Which was true. He had slept approximately 90 minutes, spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling and thinking about doors. She made the sound mothers make when they know you're lying but have decided to let it pass. Eat properly at least. He ate properly. The walk to school was 15 minutes through residential streets that had been washed clean by last night's rain, the air carrying that particular post-storm sharpness that made everything look slightly more vivid than usual. Issei walked with his hands in his pockets, bag over one shoulder, watching his own feet and thinking. The thinking went approximately as follows. He was descended from a god of destruction. He had a power in him that could erase things from existence. Drake, who had never been short of opinions on anything, had responded to all of this with careful, measured uncertainty. Rias had told him to keep it quiet. There was no established framework for what he was. This was, objectively, a lot. He was so absorbed into thinking that he almost walked into her. He noticed her peripherally first, a stillness in his field of vision that didn't belong to the normal flow of students heading towards school, something that wasn't moving with the crowd or against it, but was simply standing apart from it, as though the ordinary rules of pedestrian traffic didn't quite apply. He looked up. She was tall, taller than most of the students around her, though not so dramatically as to be immediately conspicuous. Her hair was a silvery green that caught the morning light in a way that was either unusual or, more likely, literally luminous. She was wearing what appeared to be civilian clothing, a fitted white jacket over a pale dress, nothing that immediately screamed supernatural, but it sat on her with the particular quality of a costume, the way genuinely extraordinary beings sometimes wore ordinary things, as though they were participating in normalcy rather than inhabiting it. She was holding a long staff that was either very poorly camouflaged as a parasol or not camouflaged at all, and she didn't appear to care which. Most notably, she was looking directly at him, not in the way people look at someone they've spotted in a crowd. In the way that suggested she had known exactly where he was going to be and had arrived there first, and had simply been waiting for him to notice her. Issei stopped walking. The students around him parted and flowed past without incident, the casual supernatural aura diffusion that most powerful beings projected without effort, ensuring that no one gave her a second glance. Issei Hayadu, she said. Her voice was calm and precise, the kind of voice that was accustomed to being listened to. There was an accent he couldn't place, not regional, not quite anything he had a reference point for. As though the language itself was a courtesy she was extending rather than her native medium. That's me, he said. Then, because it seemed relevant, do I know you? No, she said. But I know you. Or rather, and here something shifted in her expression, something small and genuinely interested that sat oddly with the general composure of her bearing. I know what you carry. Issei's hand, in his pocket, went still. You felt it last night, he said. Not a question. I was in the area, she said, which he recognized immediately as a non-answer of considerable sophistication. The energy signature was difficult to miss, for someone with the right sensitivity. She tilted her head slightly. You used it instinctively, without training, without understanding. That you survived the experience without disrupting the local dimensional fabric is either remarkable restraint or extraordinary luck. Little of both, probably. He looked at her more carefully. The staff, the bearing, the way she had described the energy signature with the casual precision of someone who recognized it from experience. You know what it is. What I did. Yes. And you know what I am. What's in me. Yes. He should call Rias. He was aware of this. Rias had been very clear about the instruction to not engage with unknown supernatural entities alone, particularly in the wake of last night. This was, objectively, the correct and sensible course of action. "Who are you?" he asked instead. She considered him for a moment with those eyes, a color he was going to tentatively describe as teal, and immediately recognized that was inadequate, and then, apparently reaching some internal conclusion, she inclined her head in a gesture that was not quite a bow, but carried the structure of one. "My name is Vados," she said. "I am an angel. And I believe, Issei, that you and I have a great deal to discuss." He called Rias from the school gate. The conversation was brief. Rias's voice went through several distinct tonal phases in rapid succession: initial question, sharp concern, clipped instruction, and resolved into, "Bring her to the clubroom. Do not engage in any power demonstration. Do not agree to anything." He could practically hear her already moving. Vedos accompanied him to school without comment, which raised an interesting question about whether she required any kind of invitation or whether the concept simply didn't apply to her. The answer appeared to be the latter. She walked through the school grounds with the same quality of detached observation she'd had on the street, present, but not quite subject to the ordinary requirements of the space. "You're being very calm about this," she observed, as they walked down the corridor toward the old building. "I'm not calm," Issei said. "I'm processing." "There is a distinction? I've found that if I panic first I make bad decisions, so I've trained myself to process first and panic later, when the immediate situation is handled." She made a small sound that might have been approval. "That is a practical approach. I've had a lot of practice." He pushed open the clubroom door. Rias was already there. So was everyone else. The entire peerage assembled with a speed that suggested either supernatural travel or the simple fact that they'd never really gone home after last night. Rias was standing at the center of the room in the way she stood when she was receiving something that required her to represent not just herself, but her family and position. Akino was at her right, expression pleasant and eyes sharp. Kaneko was in her chair. Kiba was near the window. Vedos stepped into the room and looked around it with the unhurried attention of someone cataloging information. The sacred gear on Issei's arm pulsed once. Faintly, almost below perception, but definitely there. "You felt that," Vedos said to the arm, without any particular inflection. "Welsh Dragon acknowledges the presence of an angel of considerable standing," Drake said, which, again, made several people in the room blink, because Drake did not typically make direct announcements. "The specific standing is not one I have a classification for." "That is reasonable," Vedos said. "I am not easily classified." She turned to Rias. "Rias Grimry, heiress of the House of Grimry, currently reincarnated devil working under the authority of the Underworld's current administration. Your ancestors served the original Beelzebub directly. Your peerage is better than its record suggests, which is itself better than average." She paused. That was not an insult. It was an observation. Rias's expression had done something very controlled during this summary. "You appear to know a great deal about us," she said, with the courteous precision of someone who has decided to treat this as a negotiation until proven otherwise. "I have had time to research," Vedos said simply. She crossed to one of the chairs and sat, settling the staff against the table with a small precise click, and looked at Rias with the patience of something that was not accustomed to rushing. "I will be direct, because I find it more efficient. I am not here to interfere with your operations, your peerage, or your territory. I am here because of him." She gestured toward Issei without looking at him, specifically, because of what he demonstrated last night. "The energy signature," Rias said. "The Hawkeye," Vedos said. "The power of destruction at its most fundamental expression. It appeared in this city last night for the first time in a very long period, emanating from someone who clearly had no idea he possessed it, and it is my area of expertise." She folded her hands in her lap with geometric precision. "I trained the previous holder for quite some time." The room went quiet. "Previous holder," Issei said. "You mean?" I was the attendant of a god of destruction, Vados said, for a very long time. The specific individual is no longer actively operational in this region, but the bloodline he left behind has continued. And last night, that bloodline produced something that required my attention. She looked at Issei directly for the first time since entering the room. The power that awakened in you is real. It is not a trick of the sacred gear. It is not a devil ability operating in an unusual way, and it is not going to go dormant again now that it has been activated. You need to understand what it is, how it works, and what using it costs. Otherwise, the next time you open that particular door, you may not be able to close it again. Silence. Aquino broke it, in the tone she used when she was asking something that sounded casual and wasn't. And in exchange for this expertise, what is it you want? Vedos looked at her. Nothing that would harm your peerage, your king, or your interests. I have my own reasons for being here, and they do not conflict with yours. A pause. At least not currently. That's not especially reassuring, Kiba said mildly. No, Vedos agreed. But it is honest. I find I prefer honesty even when it's inconvenient. Rias asked Vedos to wait outside while the peerage conferred, which Vedos agreed to with the equanimity of someone for whom waiting was not an imposition. The moment the door closed, the room shifted into rapid professional mode. Thoughts, Rias said, short and direct. Powerful, Aquino said immediately. Whatever she is operating at a level significantly above what we normally interact with. When she walked in, the room felt different, not threatening, but the way it feels near someone who could make it threatening without particularly trying. Angel, Kaneko said, but not a standard classification. Not seraph, not standard angel. Something else. I couldn't feel a heaven signature from her. Angel of a different order, Kiba said thoughtfully. Something predating the current heaven structure, perhaps, which would align with what she said about the gods of destruction, and the power predating our current supernatural framework. She knows what Issei's power is, Rias said. She was looking at Issei. And she said using it without training is dangerous. Is that your read as well, Drake? Yes, Drake said, again speaking outward rather than inward, which he continued to do when the situation warranted the full room's attention. The Hakai is not a power that can be self-taught safely. It requires a fundamental understanding of what it is, and how it interfaces with existing reality. Using it without that understanding is like, if you will permit the analogy, a child with no training attempting surgery. The child's hands work. The tools are real. The result would nonetheless be catastrophic. So we need her, Issei said. We need someone who can teach you, Rias corrected. Whether that someone is her specifically is a question of trust and intention, neither of which we can fully evaluate in a 20-minute conversation. But practically speaking, Aquino said, with characteristic pragmatism, she already knows the power exists. Sending her away doesn't unring that bell. And if she wanted to do something harmful with that knowledge, she had the opportunity last night. She didn't come last night, Issei said. She came this morning. She waited. Everyone looked at him. She could have approached me at the warehouse. She said she was in the area. She felt the energy. She knew what it was. She presumably knew it was me. But she didn't show up while I was still charged up and disoriented from using a power I didn't understand. She waited until morning, until I'd had time to process, until she could meet me in a normal civilian context. He considered this. That's not nothing. Whatever she wants, she wasn't in a hurry in a way that suggested urgency. She came on her own timeline. Rias studied him. Then, all right. Let's hear what she has to say. Formally, with everyone present. She looked at Aquino. Tea. Aquino smiled with genuine warmth and went to put the kettle on. Vedos returned to the room and accepted tea with the grace of someone for whom the gesture was understood as what it was, an extension of hospitality that also functioned as a tacit temporary truce. She explained, over the next 40 minutes, with a precision and economy of language that seemed to be her natural mode, what she knew. Gods of destruction, she said, were not unique to any single mythological or supernatural tradition. They were a category of being that existed across multiple cosmological frameworks, fulfilling the same fundamental function under different names in different systems. The critical thing was the nature of that function, not destruction as an act of aggression or malice, but destruction as a necessary counterpart to creation. The universe, she explained, could not maintain balance if things only ever came into being. Things also needed to end. The gods of destruction were the embodiment of that principle, given consciousness and authority. Their power was the Hakai, a word in a language older than any currently spoken, the ability to impose ending on things. To look at something that existed and determine that it should not. Used with precision, it could remove a single cell from a living body. Used without precision, it could erase a city. Issei, she said, carried a diluted version of this bloodline, diluted enough that it had been dormant through his entire life until last night, but real enough that it had been there all along, waiting for the right trigger. The near-death state, combined with the ancient energy of the corrupted stray devil, had been that trigger. Now that it was active, it would not become dormant again. It would, in fact, continue to develop whether he wanted it to or not. The bloodline, once awoken, would push toward expression. The question was whether that expression would be controlled or uncontrolled. Uncontrolled how bad? Kaneko asked, cutting to what everyone was thinking. He erased a stray devil last night, Vedos said. Without training, without understanding, with a single instinctive gesture. As the power develops without guidance, the threshold for triggering it will lower. Eventually, ordinary emotional states, anger, grief, extreme stress, could trigger a Hakai event. At his current level, the radius would be limited. As the power matures, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. So training isn't optional, Rhea said. Training is not optional, Vados confirmed. And you're proposing to provide that training. I am proposing to begin providing it, yes. I should note, she paused, and something in her expression shifted slightly, enough to be noticeable, not enough to be readable, that I am not doing this purely out of altruism. The bloodline of Beerus appearing in this dimension is significant. I have an interest in ensuring that significance does not become catastrophic. Beerus, Rhys repeated, and the weight she put on the name indicated she'd been doing research of her own since last night. We found references, old ones, from sources that don't usually talk about things outside the three-faction framework. The name appears in cosmological texts as a being of absolute authority over destruction. That is accurate. The texts describe him as one of the most powerful beings in existence. Also accurate, and his blood is an Issei. Diluted, Vedos said. Considerably. But yes, the essential nature is there. She looked at Issei with that small, precisely controlled expression that seemed to be her version of something warmer than neutrality. What you carry is not the full power of a god of destruction. It may never be. But it is real, and it is yours. And with proper development, it will make you something that the current supernatural framework of this world has no category for. Issei thought about the door in his chest. The cool absolute certainty on the other side of it. Okay, he said. Rhys looked at him. Issei, she's right, he said simply. I can feel it. The door's still there. It's going to open again with, or without me understanding what's on the other side of it. I'd rather understand. He looked at Vados. When do we start? Vados looked at him for a moment with those inadequately described teal eyes. Tomorrow, she said. Before dawn. The early hours are better for this kind of work. Fewer ambient energies to interfere with the training signature. Where? I will find an appropriate location. I will send you the coordinates. A pause. I do not have your contact information. There was a brief, almost absurd pause while Issei got out his phone and Vados looked at it with the expression of someone who was familiar with the concept of mobile phones from the outside but had never personally operated one. He held it out to her. She examined it for a moment, then produced a small card from somewhere, plain white. with a sequence of digits on it that was longer than a standard phone number, but appeared to function as one, and handed it to him. "That will reach me," she said. "Right." He looked at the card, then at her. "Can I ask you something?" "You may ask." "You said you trained the previous holder, the god of destruction whose bloodline I carry." He watched her carefully. "What was that like?" Something moved in Vados' expression. Very small, very controlled. The kind of movement that, in a being of her particular composure, represented something considerably larger than it appeared. "Instructive," she said. "For both of us." It was not a complete answer. He filed it away. After Vedos left, departing the school grounds with the same quality of disconnection from ordinary spatial constraints with which she'd arrived, the clubroom reconvened in a different register. The formal meeting posture dissolved, replaced by the more natural configuration of people who had just experienced something significant and needed to decompress. Akino refilled everyone's tea. Kaneko migrated from her chair to the sofa and acquired a second cat from somewhere. Issei had long since stopped questioning where Kaneko's cats came from. Kiba sat back and looked at the ceiling with the thoughtful expression of someone turning over multiple chess moves simultaneously. Ria sat across from Issei and looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once. "She knows more than she's telling us," Ria said. "Obviously," Issei agreed. "But most of what she did tell us checked out against what Drake said last night, and against the sources you found. She's not lying about the core facts. She may be managing what facts she presents." "Sure. But that's what everyone does. Including us." He met Ria's eyes. "I trust her enough to train with her. I don't think she's going to hurt me, based on instinct." He paused. "And the fact that if she wanted to do something to me, she had better opportunities than showing up at my school gate and asking nicely." Rias was quiet for a moment. Then, in the voice she reserved for things that actually concerned her rather than things that merely required management, "Be careful, Issei. Always. You're terrible at that." "I'm getting better." She made a sound that was caught between fond exasperation and genuine worry, which was a sound Rias Gremory was surprisingly good at. From across the room, so quietly that it might have been imagined, Kaneko said, "She looked at him differently than she looked at the rest of us." Everyone turned to look at her. She was examining her cat with apparent total absorption. "Differently how?" Akino asked, with the delicate precision of someone very interested in the answer. "Like a problem she finds interesting," Kaneko said. "Instead of a problem she finds manageable." A pause. "There's a difference." The room absorbed this. Issei looked down at the plain white card in his hand. The sequence of digits that was longer than a standard phone number, but would apparently reach her. He thought about the way she had looked at him on the street that morning, already knowing exactly where he'd be, already waiting, and the way she'd said "instructive" for both of us when he'd asked about the god of destruction she trained, and the small controlled shift in her expression when she'd said it. He thought about the door in his chest, and the cool certainty on the other side of it, and the fact that for all the strangeness of last night, using the power had felt like something belonging to him, something that had always been his. He put the card in his pocket. Outside, the morning had gone fully bright, autumn sunlight cutting clean and sharp through the post-rain air, the kind of clarity that came after storms. Somewhere in a part of existence that didn't map to standard coordinates, Vedos moved with precise efficiency, already calculating what a first training session with an untrained descendant of a god of destruction would require, already planning the exercises, already ordering in her mind the foundational concepts that would need to be established before any real work could begin. And underneath the calculation, underneath the professional assessment and the cosmic arithmetic of power and training and developmental trajectory, something else moved, quieter and less categorized and considerably more interesting to observe, if anyone had been positioned to do so. She had looked at him differently than she'd looked at the rest of them. Like a problem she found interesting. She acknowledged to herself with characteristic precision, not wrong about that assessment. He was interesting. The bloodline was interesting. The way it had expressed itself was interesting. The way he had responded to discovering it, not with panic, not with denial, but with that calm processional practicality, I process first and panic later, was interesting. She raised her staff and stepped between one point in reality and another with the ease of long practice. Tomorrow morning, before dawn, she found herself with something that was not quite anticipation but occupied roughly the same space, looking forward to it. The alarm went off at 4 in the morning. Issei silenced it before the second pulse, already awake. He had been awake for the past hour, lying in the dark listening to the house breathe around him, the distant sound of his father's even snoring through the wall, the creak of the roof settling in the pre-dawn cold, the occasional car on the street outside. He dressed quietly, left a note in the kitchen that said early study session, back before school, which was the kind of lie that was true in spirit, if not in specifics, and stepped out into the dark. The coordinates Vados had sent, delivered via a message that appeared on his phone at exactly 11:45 the previous night, formatted with the same spare precision as everything else about her, led to the mountains north of Ko. Not extremely far, but far enough that he needed to fly. He activated the energy in his legs that he developed for aerial movement, lifted off the residential street with practiced quiet, and went north. The mountains at 4 in the morning were a different thing entirely from the mountains at any other hour. The darkness was total except for stars, and there were more stars than the light-polluted air over Ko ever allowed. A dense, extraordinary wash of them across the whole sky, the kind of sky that made you understand why ancient people had built entire religions around it. The air was cold enough to sting, carrying the smell of pine and stone and altitude. He found the location by coordinates and by the faint, unmistakable quality of something having adjusted the local energy environment, the same way you could walk into a room and immediately know whether someone had been there recently, except applied to reality itself. The location was a natural plateau, perhaps 40 meters across, on the face of a mountain that had no trails leading to it. The stone was flat and clear, dusted with frost. The drop on 3 sides was several hundred meters. Above, the stars blazed without interference. Vedos was already there. She was standing at the center of the plateau with her staff planted beside her, looking up at the sky with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the composed assessment she'd worn in the clubroom, not the calibrated patience of their street encounter, but something quieter, something that might have belonged to someone much older, looking at something much longer. She heard him land, or simply knew he was there, which seemed more likely, and brought her gaze down from the stars to him with the unhurried ease of someone who had no need to be startled by anything. "You're on time," she said. "You said before dawn," he said. "It's before dawn." Many people interpret instructions as approximate. You did not. A small pause. Good. He looked around the plateau. You picked this? The altitude reduces interference from the ambient devil and angel energy that saturates the area around Ko. The isolation prevents collateral damage if anything goes wrong. She looked at him evenly. Things may go wrong. Comforting. I prefer accurate over comforting. I know. He rolled his shoulders, settled his weight, looked at her across the frosted stone. So, how do we start? Vedos set her staff aside, leaning it against a rock with the careful deliberateness of someone who respected their tools, and turned to face him fully. Without the staff she was somehow simultaneously more ordinary and more present, the way truly powerful things sometimes became more apparent when they weren't mediated by objects. "Before we do anything practical," she said, "I need to understand your current relationship with the power. Not what it did last night, I observed that. I need to understand what you experienced." She looked at him with the directness that seemed to be her natural mode of attention. "Describe it." "Everything you felt in sequence." He described it. All of it, the door in his chest, the cool quality of what came through it, the way the motions had been below thought and below instinct, the way the straight devil had simply ceased without violence or drama or residue. Vados listened without interruption, which he was learning to recognize as a significant gesture from her. She seemed fully capable of interrupting when she felt it was warranted, which meant not interrupting was a choice. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Door, she said. That is an interesting metaphor. It's what it felt like. Many people who carry this bloodline and have expressed it describe it differently. Some describe a sound. Some describe a color. Some describe a temperature. She looked at him thoughtfully. A door implies an architectural understanding. Something with a threshold, a distinction between inside and outside, something that can be opened and closed by intention. She paused. That may actually be more useful than most of the alternatives. So the metaphor matters? The metaphor is how your mind has organized the experience of accessing a power that has no natural language in the framework you were raised in. Yes, it matters. The mind's architecture for a power shapes how that power can be directed. She picked up a small stone from the plateau's surface and held it out to him. Take this. He took it. A piece of gray mountain rock, irregular, cold from the frost. About the size of a marble. Open the door, Vados said. He looked at her. Just like that? You opened it last night under extreme duress with no preparation and no understanding. Now you are neither injured nor afraid, and I am standing 3 meters away with full attention on you. Open the door. He looked at the stone in his hand. The thing was, he could feel it, the door. He had been able to feel it all night, a constant low-level awareness in the center of his chest, the way you were always aware of a sound after someone had pointed it out. Before last night, he simply hadn't known it was there. Now he could not know. He reached for it. It was harder than last night. Last night it had opened on its own, driven by desperation and survival instinct. Now, attempting to open it deliberately, with nothing pushing him, he discovered that the mechanism was different from anything he'd worked with before. Devil power responded to intention and training. Sacred gear power built on itself, additive. This was neither. He stood there for a full 90 seconds before Vedos spoke. Stop trying to push it, she said. You are approaching it like a muscle. It is not a muscle. Then what is it? It is an authority, she said. The Hawkeye is not a force you produce. It is a right you invoke. The distinction is fundamental. She moved to stand beside him, not in front, not confrontationally, but beside, looking at the same stone. Force requires exertion. Authority requires recognition. You are not trying to generate destruction. You are recognizing your right to determine that this stone need not continue in its current form. Issei looked at the stone. He tried to think about it differently. Not push, not reach, not produce, recognize. He had the right. Beerus, his ancestor, ancient and absolute, had carried this authority as his fundamental nature, and some fragment of that nature was in Issei's blood, had always been in his blood, had simply been waiting for him to know about it. The door shifted, not open, not fully, but unlocked. He could feel the distinction, the difference between the jammed-shut feeling of the previous 90 seconds and this new state, which was more like a door that was closed but not locked, that could be opened with the right motion. The stone in his hand went dim, not erased. He caught it before it got that far, pulled back instinctively, but the surface of it, the outermost layer of rock, simply ceased. What remained was smaller, and had a slightly different shape. The removal absolutely clean, no dust, no residue. He opened his hand and stared at it. There, Vados said quietly. I stopped it, he said. Before it finished. Yes. You exercised control. She looked at the diminished stone with an expression that, in a different person, he might have called pleased. That is significantly more than most people manage in the first session. What do most people manage? Complete erasure, uncontrolled, followed by a period of unconsciousness while the body and mind adjust to the experience of invoking that level of authority. She reached over and took the remaining piece of stone from his hand, examining it with professional interest. The authority concept appears to work well for you. The door metaphor is structurally compatible with it. A door is something that can be opened partially. He looked at his hand, which was slightly cold where the stone had rested. That's it? For the first session? Vados looked at him with what he was beginning to recognize as her version of mild amusement, which expressed itself as a fractional change in the set of her mouth and a quality of attention that was slightly more direct than usual. No. That was the first exercise. We have 2 hours before you need to return to school, he exhaled. Right. The next exercise, she set the diminished stone down carefully, is the same thing, but larger. She picked up a rock roughly the size of a football. 2 hours later, as the sky was going from black to deep blue to the first pale edge of dawn, Issei sat on the edge of the plateau with his feet hanging over the drop and his head tipped back against the cold air and felt, for the first time in recent memory, a particular kind of exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical damage. Nothing hurt. His ribs were fully healed from the previous night, and the training hadn't involved any physical exertion in the conventional sense, but the kind of sustained, deliberate attention he'd been applying for 2 hours, the careful invoking and controlling and stopping of the authority, over and over, on progressively larger and more complex objects, had produced a weariness that sat somewhere deeper than muscle. Vedos settled beside him on the edge with the unconscious grace of someone for whom heights and edges were simply irrelevant. She looked out at the mountain range going from darkness to color in the spreading dawn. You will be tired today, she said. Mentally. The kind of tired that makes sustained attention difficult. Great for school. You will manage. The effect diminishes after the first few sessions as the mind acclimates. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon. You have a question. It wasn't quite a question. More an observation, delivered with the certainty of someone who had been paying close attention for 2 hours. A few, he admitted. Ask them. He looked at the sky lightning. Last night, when you said you trained the previous holder, you meant Beerus. Directly? Yes. For how long? A very long time, she said. The concept of duration becomes complicated when applied to beings who exist outside standard time frameworks, but by any reasonable human measurement, centuries. He turned that over. What was he like? Vados was quiet for longer than usual, which, from Vados, was notable. He was, she said finally, choosing each word with apparent care, precisely what a god of destruction is supposed to be. Absolute in his authority, entirely unimpressed by things that most beings find impressive, capable of extraordinary destruction and occasionally, when sufficiently motivated, extraordinary restraint. Another pause. He was also, when not actively performing his function, capable of being remarkably, I believe the word is particular, about small things. His food. His sleep. The specific texture of his napping cushion. Issei stared at her. The god of destruction had opinions about his napping cushion. Very strong opinions, Vados said, with the gravity of someone relating a deeply significant fact. Issei laughed. He didn't mean to. It arrived before he could manage it, real and sudden, the laugh of someone who finds something genuinely funny rather than politely amusing. It came out into the cold mountain air and dispersed, and Vados watched it happen with that fractional change expression that he was now fairly certain was her version of a smile. He would have found that funny too, she said quietly. Eventually. After the initial outrage at being laughed at. He sounds like a character. He was. A pause. He is. The distinction, as I said, is complicated. She looked back at the horizon. He would have found you interesting, I think. The bloodline in a setting like this, a devil-adjacent world with a sacred gear and an ordinary human upbringing layered over the fundamental nature. He would have found that interesting, in the way he found most things interesting, which is to say, he would have expressed it as mild disdain while clearly paying close attention. Sounds like someone I know, Issei said. Vados looked at him. He met her eyes. The mild disdain while clearly paying close attention thing. She was quiet for a moment. I do not express disdain. No, he agreed. You express assessment. but the paying close attention part is definitely familiar. Something in her expression did the small controlled shift. He was getting better at reading it. The shift meant he had said something that landed, that went past the composed surface and touched something underneath. She looked back at the horizon rather quickly, which was interesting because Vados did not, as a rule, look away quickly from things. The next session, she said, in the tone of someone returning to a professional footing, will be in 2 days. The interval allows for consolidation. The mind needs time to integrate what it has learned about invoking the authority. 2 days, he agreed. Then, Vedos. She looked at him. Thank you, he said simply. For coming. For explaining things. For, he gestured at the plateau, the diminished rocks, the 2 hours of careful patient instruction. This, she regarded him with that quality of attention that was, he had decided, the most characteristic thing about her. Not quite like how anyone else he'd ever met paid attention. As though when Vedos looked at something, she was genuinely seeing it, without the filters of assumption or boredom or preconception. You are welcome, she said, which he had the impression was not a phrase she used particularly often. He stood, stretched, looked at the sky that was now definitively dawn, gold and pale blue and deepening with the first suggestion of morning color. I should get back. Yes. She stood as well, retrieved her staff. Be careful with the door today. The threshold will be lower for the next 24 hours. Avoid situations of extreme emotional stress if possible. I'll try. Kaneko might test that, but I'll try. The fractional expression again. He was starting to collect them the way people collected particularly good moments. Not for any conscious reason, just because they seemed worth keeping. He lifted off the plateau and turned south toward Kuo. Below him, on the mountain, Vedos watched him go with her staff resting lightly in her hand, and the dawn spreading across the sky behind her, and did not immediately leave, which was unusual for someone as efficient with her time as she was. The day at school was exactly as cognitively difficult as Vedos had predicted. He sat through 3 classes in a state of maintained functionality that required approximately 4 times the usual effort, the deeper than physical tiredness sitting behind his eyes, and making sustained focus feel like pushing through water. He took notes more or less correctly. He answered when directly called upon. During lunch, he sat with Motohama and Matsuda and responded to their conversation on autopilot, while his mind kept returning to the plateau, the diminished stone, the cool recognition of authority, the door opening partially. You look terrible, Matsuda said cheerfully, with the particular cheerfulness of someone who considers looking terrible a reasonable cost for nocturnal activities they assume are interesting. Thanks. Were you out doing devil stuff? I was out doing early study, Issei said, which technically Matsuda had no way to disprove. Matsuda squinted. You don't study. I'm branching out. After lunch, he went to the clubroom, where Rias was waiting with the expression of someone who had been waiting with it for most of the morning. How was it? She asked. He told her what he could. The exercises, the authority not force framework, the partial opening and stopping, the accumulated 2 hours. He did not tell her about the conversation on the plateau edge, the way Vados had described Beerus's napping cushion with perfect gravity, the small controlled shift in her expression when he'd said the paying close attention thing. Some things were easier to keep as they were for a while. Rias listened carefully. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her tea. The authority framework, she said. That's philosophically interesting. Devil power is much more aligned with force, with pushing, generating, producing. The idea of power as a right rather than a production is, she considered. Actually, it maps onto very old ideas about divine authority. The power of a king isn't that they're physically stronger than everyone else. It's that they have the right to make certain determinations, and that right is recognized. Yeah, Issei said. That's pretty much exactly what she said. Rias looked at him. She's a good teacher. She's a very good teacher. He paused. She's also something else. I'm not sure what yet. Rias's expression did something careful and perceptive that Rias's expressions occasionally did. She did not say anything about it, which was its own kind of statement. Aquino has been doing some additional research, she said, transitioning smoothly, on the cosmological framework Vedos seems to belong to. There is very little in Devil Archives. The three-faction world simply doesn't have detailed records of what exists beyond its own framework. But there are references, in texts that predate the current Devil hierarchy, to a system of universes, each with a god of destruction and an attendant angel of a specific class. The angel's title, in the oldest texts, she paused, translates approximately as attendant of destruction. An angel dedicated to serving a god of destruction, Issei said. Dedicated to guiding and advising, yes. And training. Rias looked at him steadily. Her entire function, her fundamental purpose, is oriented toward beings like what you carry. She isn't just someone who happens to have relevant expertise. It's what she is. He sat with that for a moment. No wonder she recognized it immediately, he said. No wonder, Rias agreed. Then, carefully, Issei. She is going to be a significant presence in your life, at least for the near future. I want you to be aware of that going into it, rather than finding it out gradually. I know. And I want you to be careful. She paused. Not because I think she's dangerous to you in the conventional sense. I think she probably isn't. But because she chose her words with visible care. Beings of that nature, who operate at that level, experience things differently than we do. They're not inhuman in their feelings, but the scale and the timeline and the context are different. I would not want you to mistake genuine interest for something more available than it is. He looked at his tea. Then at Rias. That's very specific advice. I'm a very specific person. He almost said something, then reconsidered. Rias was not wrong, and she was saying it out of genuine care, which deserved to be received as such. I hear you, he said. I'll be careful. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something was settled. That evening, in his room, he got a message. It arrived on his phone at 8:47, a time that was specific enough to suggest it had not been sent casually, as though Vados had calculated the most appropriate window for non-urgent communication and determined this was it. The first session produced better results than initially projected. Adjust your expectation for the second session accordingly. It will be more difficult. The gap between first and second is typically larger than subsequent gaps. He read it twice. Then wrote back, thanks for the warning. Should I be worried about the harder? The reply came after a pause of about 3 minutes, which he suspected was not the time it took her to compose the message, but the time she decided was appropriate before sending it. No. Difficult is not the same as dangerous. You have good instincts for the authority concept. The difficulty in Session 2 is that we will be working with living things rather than inanimate objects. The authority becomes more nuanced when what you are erasing has its own volition. He looked at that for a moment. Living things like what? Plants, initially. Then insects, if you're ready. The volition is minimal but present, and that is sufficient for the exercise. Got it. See you in 2 days. Another pause. Slightly longer than the previous one. Sleep well, Issei Hayadu. He looked at that for a long moment. It was a perfectly ordinary thing to say. A polite close to a professional exchange. Absolutely nothing remarkable about it. He was aware, with the part of his mind that processed things honestly when he let it, that it did not feel particularly ordinary. He set the phone down and looked at the ceiling. The door in his chest was quiet. The lower threshold Vados had warned him about manifesting as a slightly more present awareness than usual, like tinnitus, constant and low and ignorable as long as nothing upset it. He breathed around it carefully, the way she'd shown him, not trying to close the door, not pushing against it, simply existing alongside it. Authority, not force. Recognition, not production. He thought about sitting on the edge of a mountain plateau as the sky turned from black to gold, and an ancient composed being looking at the horizon and telling him, with complete gravity, about a god of destruction's opinions on napping cushions. He thought about the way she'd looked away quickly. Drig, he said to the ceiling. Partner, Drake said, with the air of someone who had been quietly present for all of this. What do you think of her? A pause that had the quality of careful composition. I think she is precisely what she presents herself as, Drake said finally, which is rare. I also think that what she presents herself as is considerably more than it appears on the surface, which is consistent with beings of that type. Another pause. I think she is paying close attention to you. Yeah, Issei said. I noticed that too, partner. Yeah, I have existed for a very long time. I have observed many things in many people. I do not typically offer observations about interpersonal matters. A pause that had the texture of an ancient dragon choosing its words with some care. But I will say, the quality of attention she pays to you is not the same as the quality of attention she pays to the others. He looked at the ceiling. Outside, the night was clear, the stars visible between his curtains. The same stars that blazed above a mountain plateau 40 kilometers north. Good night, Drake, he said. Good night, partner, the dragon said, and went quiet. Issei closed his eyes, and for the first time in 2 days, slept easily.